They tied the Apache twins to the cottonwood at the edge of Dry Creek just before sunset. When the light turns, the land the color of old blood, and dust hangs in the air like a held breath, and no one in the small ranching settlement wanted to be the last to look them in the eye, because shame is easier when it's shared. The twins were no more than 15 winters old, lean as fence posts, wrists raw from rope, dark hair matted with sweat and dirt, their backs straight despite the fear pressing hard against their ribs, and all this over a single loaf of bread taken from a storehouse, whose owner had more flour than he could count. One twin, the older by minutes and forever by bearing, stared ahead with a jaw set like stone, while the other kept glancing toward the hills, as if the land itself might rise and claim them back. The men who tied the knots spoke loudly about justice, about setting an example, but their voices shook, because deep down they knew there was no courage in punishing hunger. Someone spat, someone laughed too hard, someone else turned away. When the crowd finally thinned, leaving only the wind and the creak of rope against bark, the twins stood alone, bound and waiting, not knowing whether the night would bring mercy or wolves or worse. That was when the quiet rancher came riding in, his horse slow and steady, hooves muffled by dust, a man most folks barely noticed even though he'd lived among them for years. His name was Elias Crow, though few knew it, and fewer knew anything about him beyond the fact that he paid in coin, spoke little, and kept to the far edge of the valley where the land rose rough and unforgiving. He reined in when he saw the boys, eyes narrowing not in anger but in recognition, because he knew that look, the look of children forced to grow older than they should. He dismounted without a word, the leather of his boots worn thin, his hands scarred in ways that told stories he never shared. The older twin lifted his chin, defiant even now, and said nothing, while the younger finally spoke, voice cracked and dry, saying they hadn't meant harm, only hunger, only their grandmother's empty hands and the long winter still to come. Elias listened. He always listened. He looked at the ropes, the knots tied by men who'd learned cruelty before kindness, and something dark and heavy shifted behind his eyes. Without asking permission from ghosts or living men, he drew his knife, the blade catching the last of the sun, and cut the ropes clean. The twins staggered forward, disbelief written across their faces, waiting for the blow that didn't come. Elias told them quietly that standing still was dangerous, that night carried ears, and that if they wanted to live, they should follow him. They hesitated only a moment before obeying, because when a man cuts you loose without asking for anything in return, you remember it for the rest of your life. They walked behind him as the sky darkened, past sage and stone, past the invisible lines where cruelty pretends to be law, and when the ranch lights finally appeared, warm and low against the vast dark, the younger twin whispered that no white man had ever done such a thing for them before. Elias didn't answer. He led them to his table, set down bread and stew, and watched them eat like boys who hadn't known fullness in too long. He told them they could stay the night, then another, then as long as the land allowed. He didn't ask their names until morning. As the fire crackled and the wind moved across the plains, Elias sat alone on his porch, staring into the dark, knowing full well that kindness is a debt the world always comes to collect, and that by cutting those ropes, he had just stepped back into a story he'd spent years trying to outrun. If you're still here, still listening, understand this. Stories like these are not just about the past. They're about choices, and if you want to hear how those choices echo, how mercy reshapes fate, and how the hungry boys would change an entire valley, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because what comes next will stay with you long after the fire burns. Low-dot morning came slow over Elias Crow's ranch, the sun lifting itself over the hills like it was tired of watching men hurt one another. And when the twins woke on the rough blankets by the hearth, for a moment they thought the night had been a dream, because warmth still clung to their bones, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air, a smell that meant safety only in stories their grandmother used to tell. Elias was already awake, moving quietly, pouring coffee into a chipped tin cup, his back to them as if he didn't want gratitude or fear or questions cluttering the space between them. He told them their names mattered, that if they were going to stay they'd be known as more than those Apache boys, and the older twin said his name was Dakota, meaning friend to all. though life had tested that meaning more than once. And the younger said he was Nalan, quick to smile when he wasn't afraid, quick to hope even when hope had punished him before. Elias nodded like names were sacred things, then handed them tools, not weapons, and said food came from work, not because they owed him, but because dignity mattered. Days turned into weeks, and the valley noticed. Some ranchers muttered about thieves living under Elias's roof. Others warned him he was inviting trouble. But Elias kept his gates open and his voice calm, because he knew fear feeds on noise. The twins learned the land, how to mend fence, how to read the sky, how to move cattle without shouting. And at night Elias told them stories without saying they were stories. Fragments of a past where he'd once worn a uniform, once followed orders that felt right until they didn't, once watched boys not much older than these twins fall, because mercy arrived too late. Dakota listened like every word was a lesson carved in stone, while Nalan listened like it was a map to a life he didn't know he was allowed to want. Trouble finally came the way it always does, riding in unrighteous anger and old hatred, when the storehouse owner and two men rode out, guns visible, voices loud, demanding the boys be returned, punished, made examples of. Elias stood between them and the twins, unarmed, hands open, saying the debt for the bread had been paid 10 times over in labor, and that no man grows taller by standing on the necks of children. One rider raised his rifle. The valley held its breath. Dakota stepped forward, ready to take the bullet meant for the man who'd saved them, because loyalty, once earned, runs deeper than blood. Elias spoke then, not loudly, but with a weight that stopped the world, telling them he'd buried enough boys for crimes they never committed, that he would not bury two more to satisfy a hunger for cruelty disguised as law. Something in his eyes reminded the men that violence leaves marks long after the dust settles. They rode away, not defeated, but unwilling to test the quiet rancher's resolve. That night, Elias told the twins they were free to leave if they wished, that the world beyond the hills was wide, but the ranch would always remember their footsteps. Dakota said freedom wasn't just walking away, it was choosing where to stand. Nalan said he wanted to learn to read, to write their grandmother's stories so they wouldn't disappear. Elias nodded, throat tight, because he hadn't planned on building a family. But some things choose you. Seasons passed. The twins grew stronger, surer. The valley changed too, slowly, as kindness tends to do its work in silence. And years later, when people spoke of that ranch, they didn't talk about stolen bread anymore. They talked about the place where mercy broke a cycle, where the boys tied to a tree became men who tied a community back to its conscience. If this story moved you, if you believe one choice can change many lives, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, shared, and carried forward.